Hello and welcome to this presentation on the methods used to assess climate risk from coastal flooding in Cartagena. My name is Carlos Levy, and in this talk I will review and compare different methodological approaches used to analyze hazard, exposure and vulnerability in coastal environments. Let's get in deep. This presentation is structured around the main methodological steps used to assess coastal flood risk in Cartagena. I will begin with the identification of the study case and its key characteristics. Then, I will explain the development of impact chains which help connect hazards, exposures, and vulnerability. After that, I will review different approaches to evaluate risk, including perceived risk, expert-based risk, and indicator-based risk assessment. Finally, I will also present a quantified risk assessment. At the end, I will provide a synthesis of the findings and the main conclusions that I have done during this presentation. Cartagena de Indias is the study area for this assessment. It is a coastal city located on the Caribbean coast of Colombia and serves as the capital of the Bolivar Department. The city covers an area of around 609 square kilometers and has a population of about 1.1 million people. Cartagena is a highly attractive zone due to its strategic port, which is one of the most important in the country, as well as its standing cultural heritage and a strong tourism sector. In addition, the city hosts significant petrochemical and plastic industries together with fisheries and small-scale aquaculture. These combined economic, cultural, and environmental values make Cartagena particularly vulnerable to coastal flooding and as a relevant case for evaluating different risk assessment methodologies. Cartagena faces multiple challenges that increase its vulnerability to coastal flooding. From a climate perspective, the city experiences recurrent flooding in low-lying urban zones, ongoing sea level rise, frequent storm events, and shoreline erosion. Sanitary issues also play an important role, including problems with water quality, wave management, and limited drainage infrastructure. Social factors further identify risk with high levels of poverty, informal settlements located in flood-prone areas, and governance difficulties. Finally, geological conditions such as large subsidence worsen the exposure of the city. This slide presents some characteristics to do the impact chain for coastal flooding in Cartagena. The main drivers include sea level rise, storm surge, extreme wave, and high tides. These drivers generate hazards such as elevated water levels, coastal flooding, and erosion. The exposed elements include housing, tourism areas, key infrastructure, cultural heritage, and ecosystems. And vulnerability is increased by low elevation, poor construction quality, mobility disruption, and health risks. Altogether, these factors lead to impacts such as recurrent flooding, infrastructure damage, and the loss of the beaches. This slide summarizes the main assets affected by coastal flooding in Cartagena. The population is highly exposed, particularly in neighborhoods such as La Boquilla, Boca Grande, and La Manga. Critical infrastructure is also at risk, including coastal housing, tourist facilities, roads, the airport, and cultural heritage sites. Key ecosystems such as mangroves, beaches, dunes, coral reefs, and seagrasses are equally vulnerable. Finally, economic sectors like tourism, transport, and local commerce experience significant impacts. Consequently, this graph summarizes how the different elements I mentioned earlier connect to form the overall risk. Coastal hazards lead to flooding, which affects exposed population, infrastructure, ecosystem, and heritage sites. The final level of risk depends on how these exposures interact with local vulnerabilities, such as poor construction, drainage issues, and social conditions. Altogether, this component shapes the multidimensional coastal flood risk in the city of Cartagena. This section introduces the perceived risk analysis, which is based on a sectional survey applied in 3 coastal neighborhoods, La Boquilla, Boca Grande, and La Manga. The perceived risk Coastal Flood Risk Index integrates 4 components: the local exposure context, socio-demographic factors, indicators of perceived risk, and a simple statistical analysis. This method helps us to understand how residents interpret and respond to coastal flooding in their daily lives. In this step, data were collected using a structured questionnaire. The survey includes socio-demographic variables such as gender, education, and income, as well as exposure indicators like housing time, number of floors, distance to the shore, and previous flooding experience. Perceived risk was evaluated through 2 components: perceived likelihood and perceived severity, which each item scored from 1 to 5. These questions help capture how residents understand both the probability and the potential consequences of the coastal flooding. For this type of analysis, 3 types of statistical methods were applied. First, reliability was tested using crossbar asphalt to ensure consistency among survey items. The second include descriptive statistics such as histogram, probability distributions, means, and standard deviations were also used to summarize the responses. Third, comparative tests including Anderson normality test, ANOVA, and the Man-Whitney U-test help identify significant differences between neighborhoods. An expected outcome of this methodology applied in the study case of Cartagena, we could say that Boquilla, for example, shows very high exposure, and also we could see that Boca Grande has high exposure with the stronger differences, and finally La Manga presents major exposure with mixed socioeconomic conditions. Now let's talk about expert-based risk assessment. In this risk assessment, we can employ the classical formulation: hazard times exposures times vulnerability. The process begins with selecting a panel of specialists from coastal engineering, hydrodynamics, disaster management, urban planning, and so on. These experts scored each component on a scale from 1 to 5. Lower scores represent rare flooding, limited exposure, and strong preparedness, while higher scores indicate frequent and destructive events, high exposure, and also fragile or informal housing conditions. This method provides a structured way to incorporate professional judgments into the risk analysis. In this slide, you can see an example of expert-based risk analysis. In the below part of the slide, you can see a scoring matrix per expert, and also among all experts you can assign some weights. For example, hazard could be a weight of 0.40, while exposure and vulnerability could score 0.30 each one. With that information, you can create a weighted risk, and you can see on the formula, and then compute a risk by all experts. Finally, you can use some statistics as mean, median, box plot to compare with the neighborhoods. In the indicator-based assessment, risk is estimated using measurable variables for hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. Hazard includes the percentage of flooded area and expected flood depth. Exposure is represented by population density, and vulnerability is described through socioeconomic indicators such as poverty, informal housing, education level, and access to preparedness systems. The workflow, as you can see in the right part, involves collecting and processing data in QGIS, normalizing all indicators, to finally building composite indices for hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. At the end, with this information, you can compute and classify a multiplicative risk index. Here in this slide, you can see an example that I did in an Excel sheet related with measurable indicators in the neighborhood of La Boca Grande in Cartagena. You can see in the slide different indicators with some threshold, X-min and X-max, and all the process carried out that I described before, like normalization, average, computing the final risk category and assign some values to determine if it's low, medium, or high. In the quantitative approach, risk is calculated as the sum of probabilities of different fluid scenarios multiplied by their consequences. Probabilities are derived from aerodynamic and fluid modeling, which provide water depth for different return periods. Consequences are estimated by combining exposure data, such as buildings and population, with vulnerability functions that translate fluid depth into damage. By multiplying expected damage by their annual probabilities, we obtain the expected annual damage which represent the final quantitative risk. The figure on the right describes better the information that I have provided. To build the hazard component, first it's necessary to compile the key datasets, including bathymetry, high-resolution topography, tide, source records, wave climate, and sea level rise projections. These inputs feed into numerical models such as Delft 3D, Mike 21, and so on. For each scenario, for example, the 100 GR total water level in 2050. The models process bathymetry, DEM, rawness, boundary, water levels, and waves. The outputs are maps of maximum water depth and, when needed, flow velocity. These maps form the basis for the subsequent damage and risk calculations. To estimate consequences, we first define exposure using detailed spatial data, building characteristics, land use types, population, distributions, and economic values. These datasets are processed in GIS and overlaid with fluid depth math to assign a value to each exposed element. Vulnerability is then represented through these depth damage functions, which relate water depth to the proportion of damage. For example, shallow flooding causes little to no damage, while depth above 1 meter may result in losses exceeding 60%. Combining exposure values with these damage ratios give us the expected damage for each location. Once we estimate the damage for each element, we aggregate it to obtain the total expected damage per scenario. Each scenario is then weighted by its annual probability, calculated as the inverse of the return period. Summing the probability-weighted damages gives the expected annual damage, or EAD. Finally, it is possible to map the results at the building or cell level, allowing us to classify areas into low, medium, or high risk based on annual economic losses in dollars per year, for example. This slide shows a simple example of how the quantitative risk calculation works for a single cell in Boca Grande. We start with 100 residential buildings, each with a reconstruction value of $200,000. For the fluid scenarios, 20 GR and 100 GR events, we use model flood depth and depth damage curves to estimate the damage per building. Multiplied by the number of flooded buildings give total consequences for each scenario. Finally, applying the annual probability, it is possible to compute the expected annual damage, which for this cell is about $0.22 million per year. As main synthesis and conclusion, each method offers a different perspective on coastal flood risk in Cartagena. The first one, perceived risk, helps us understand how communities interpret and respond to hazards. On the other hand, expert-based approaches are useful for rapid assessments when data are limited. Indicator-based methods support broader data-driven regional comparisons. And finally, fully quantitative models provide the detail needed for engineering design, investment decisions, and cost-benefit analysis. Together, these approaches offer a comprehensive framework for risk evaluation. Thank you so much for your attention.